I've wanted a crosscut sled since I can remember, so I bought these plans to see how easy this one is to make.
This'll be fun.
The first step is to measure and mark all the cuts I'll make on this 2x4 foot sheet of plywood. There's an extension included in the plans, but I won't be using that on mine. The way it's constructed, I can always go back and add it later if I want. This first cut made smaller pieces that were easier to handle. I then cut the pieces for the front fence of the sled. I 3D printed this fence stop because I'm frugal. I also cut the pieces for the blade guards on the fence. The fence needs time to dry, so I glued and clamped it to let it sit overnight. Painter's tape to keep the glue from sticking to the work surface, and a level when clamping to keep the fence flat and straight as the glue dries. Moving on to the base, I measured and marked the lines for the final shape of the sled. I used a jigsaw to make these cuts. Removing these pieces will lighten the sled a bit. Then a little sanding to remove the tear out from the saw. I marked the center of the back of the sled for the position of the blade slot or kerf and positioned the T-tracks, keeping them clear of the miter slots on the saw. Then I marked their position. I'll use these lines to make a channel or dado for the tracks to sit in. Using a router and edge guide, I cut the dados and ended up with a nice tight fit. I bought a pack of 4 2-foot T-tracks for this project and will have a little left over after it's all installed. These 2 cutoff pieces will fit nicely in the third dado. It's a little short, but that's okay since the fence will cover the gap. Using the remaining plywood, I cut the pieces for the back fence over the blade. I glued and clamped these together for an overnight dry. While I was at it, I also glued up the pieces for the blade guards on the front fence. After all the glue was dry, I cleaned up the glue edges on the table saw. I also cut 45-degree corners on both fences and the blade guards just to make it pretty. I marked the position of the T-track on the top of the front fence, and since I don't have a table router, I'll use a few passes on my table saw to cut this dado. Next, I glued the blade guard for the bevel cut end of the sled onto the fence. I probably should have waited to cut the 45 here until after this was glued on, but no biggie. It was now time to attach the back fence. I clamped it into position, pre-drilled some holes, and set it in place with 3 screws. The third screw is a mistake you'll see in a minute. I 3D printed some miter rails, and the first one didn't work to my liking, which is why the top of my sled has fill hole scars. So much for keeping it pretty. 3D printing is a great way to make tools and accessories for the shop. Let me know in the comments if you've printed anything useful. These are a little bit too wide, but after a little sanding, they fit. Before I attach the miter rails, I want to cut the slot for the blade so I can use the blade and the front of my table saw to get a good alignment on the rails. Oh yeah, that third screw. I'm an idiot. Problem solved. Back to cutting the slot. To temporarily attach the guide rails, I placed a few washers in the miter to raise them so they touch the bottom of the sled. I hear nickels work well for this also. I used painter's tape and CA glue to stick the rails on. This method gives firm adhesion but is also easy to remove. Double-sided tape could also be used. I used the blade and the front of my saw for a good alignment. After pre-drilling holes and removing the painter's tape, I locked them in with screws. 3D printed rails won't bow, bend, or swell, and the holes and countersink are built right in. Up next was attaching the T-tracks. My screws were a little too long, so I cut them shorter using a rotary tool. I used a 2-part epoxy under the tracks for a stronger hold. I moved on to attaching the front fence. It needs to be as square as possible to the blade or the sled isn't really serving its purpose. Neither the plans nor the reference video really explain how to get the fence square, so I went down the rabbit hole of how to square a cross-cut sled fence. I tried the 5-cut method using the nifty online calculator to determine how many thousandths of an inch to adjust the fence, and after 3 tries it still wasn't square. I guess my brain doesn't work that way. It finally occurred to me that all of these methods use the blade as reference for one side of square. So why not use a square against the blade to square the fence? Maybe I got lucky, but it was square enough for me after the first try. Now that the hardest part is done, I glued the front center blade guard on the fence using a few temporary screws to hold until the glue dries, followed by locking down the tracks on top of the fence. These are for the 3D printed stop I showed earlier. There's plenty of room for longer screws here. Once attached, I cut off the extra track with a hacksaw. Now I'm ready to cut the 45-degree bevel feature on one end of the sled. This is a really cool feature and I'm really looking forward to... What the heck? My blade doesn't tilt the same direction as the saw used for the plans. No fault of the plans, this is on me for not checking. Doesn't matter, this is still one of the coolest and most useful additions I've made to the shop. It cuts square. The tracks allow me to clamp down boards tight. It's easy to set up for accurate 45s. With an angle finder, I can set it to any angle I need. With the stop on the fence, I can easily make repeatable cuts. I added a few holes on the edge so I could hang it on nails when not in use. It's a great sled that's easy to build, and I highly recommend it to anyone who needs one. Source links to this sled as well as other videos I referenced are available in the description. I'm not affiliated with any of them, but I like to share what I found useful. Thanks for watching, and I hope this video has helped you out or inspired you to make something. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss any of the exciting videos I have coming up, and I'll talk to you in the next episode.